So it's a very great pleasure to be able to talk to Martin Rees, who for many years has been a co-fellow of King's College here in Cambridge. Welcome to this series, Martin.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Tell me, when were you born and where?
I was born in 1942, and I was born in York. And when I say that, people think I'm a Yorkshireman. But in fact, my roots are in the Welsh border country, and I was born in York because at that time my father was doing his basic RAF training at some camp in Yorkshire, and so we were billeted in that area. But at the age of 1, I moved back to Wales, and the Welsh borders is where I grew up.
Lovely. Tell me something about your family background, as far back as you would like to go.
Well, I can't go back that far actually, but my grandfather was a ship's engineer on a banana boat, and his family were farmers in Montgomeryshire and Shropshire, and my mother's family were shopkeepers and similar. My earliest memories really are of my parents, naturally, and they were both school teachers.
What did they teach?
My father was an English graduate from Cambridge, and he taught Cambridge. He taught.
And your mother?
My father was an English graduate from Cambridge, and he taught in a variety of secondary schools and also briefly in a teachers' training college. And my mother was someone who had done elementary education training, verbal training, and she taught in primary schools. Right.
Do you want to do your mother again?
Okay, yes,
for Freudian reasons.
Yes, okay. Yes, well, I'll do both again. My father was a Cambridge graduate in English, and he taught in a variety of schools, and he taught in teachers' training colleges, and later in life he started his own school. And my mother had also had training as a junior school teacher, and she had also taught in other schools. In fact, my parents met when they were both teaching at the same school in the late 1930s.
Okay, something about their characters and influence on you.
Well, I was an only child, and I suppose my earliest childhood, of which memories are rather vague, were isolated, but I had a great deal of attention from my mother because this was during the war when we lived in a fairly isolated village in Wales. After the war, my mother briefly ran a small private school near Birkenhead, but then my earliest memories are of 1948, when my parents jointly decided to start a private boarding school in South Shropshire, and they rented a very large and beautiful decayed mansion in South Shropshire, and we moved there, and my upbringing was in these rather beautiful and isolated surroundings.
Did you go to that school?
I went to that school until I was 13, and then had the choice of either going as a day boy to the nearest grammar school that was 14 miles away, or being sent as a boarder to Shrewsbury School, which was a public school about 30 miles away. And my parents chose the latter, so from the age of 13 to 18 I went as a boarder.
During that sort of lonely time in this Welsh garden, do you think there was, I'm always looking for roots, do you think there was, did you become interested in natural history or in stars or in anything at that point, do you think?
I don't think I had any particular interest in astronomy or indeed in science. I was interested in figures and numbers from an early age, and in how things worked. But I think I was just as interested in literary things and in history. And if I look at how I ended up being a specialist in science, it's not through any early commitment or ambition. It's really that during my school career I always found languages the worst subject. And so in order to avoid languages, I tended to shift when specialisation was needed into science and mathematics.
When you went to Shrewsbury, were there any teachers there who particularly influenced you?
Well, I was very lucky. It was a rather old-fashioned public school with ethos, which even then I didn't really relate to optimally, and which I in retrospect don't either. But it was extremely well staffed, especially in sciences, and I was very well taught in all subjects, particularly in science. And indeed, I think there are lessons to be learnt about the teaching profession and the opportunities for people in different generations, because I recall in particular the senior physics master at that time, who was then already about 60, and he had been a Cambridge graduate for the first, in I suppose, the 1920s, and he had been told when at Cambridge that he wasn't good enough to do research because there were better people in his year. He then went into teaching, and the best person in his year was Neville Mott, one of the greatest physicists of the century, and so that indicates that into teaching in the 1930s one got people who would in later decades have had other kinds of careers, and so people of my generation were the beneficiaries of outstanding teaching by committed and very able people. So I am extremely grateful that I was well enough taught to get myself into Cambridge.
Do you remember this man's name?
His name was Bill Matthews, and he was one of several excellent teachers I had. Most of them are no longer with us, but one who is still alive, called Jeff Chu, went on to be a keeper at the Science Museum, and he's in his 90s now, but still alive, and I remember very well his magnificent teaching of physics, the very neat notes he produced on some primitive duplicating machine for the entire class, and the very good start that he gave to all his pupils in science.
Is that T-E-W? Tew?
C-H-E-W.
C-H-E-W. Sounds
Yes.
vaguely Chinese.
No, very English in fact.
So, while you were there, were you interested in other things, in games, sports, music, anything else?
Well, I was interested in music. I had no great talent for music, but I was put to the piano as a child, for which I'm very grateful. I was still bash out the slow movements when no one's listening. And so I learned the piano, and I even sang in the choir, something which I'm again grateful for. And of my memories of the school, one of the most pleasant actually is of the chapel services. I've never been very religious, but certainly the singing in the choir and in the congregation was something which was one of the most pleasant features of a school like that. So I was interested in music. As far as sport, my high point was coxing a rowing 4 and doing this not very well, so I had no successes there.
You were beginning to specialise. I mean, in those days it was O-levels and A-levels. What A-levels did you do, for instance?
Well, I was at this school which was rather traditional, and the highest prestige subject was the classics, which I didn't do, of course. The classics sat in the front row in chapel and all that. But they had, as I said, the very good teaching in maths and science, and I specialised in mathematics and physics, and those were the subjects I did mainly in A-level. And I was told to apply to Cambridge, and I applied to Trinity College, and took the entrance exam there. And I did this without any great awareness of what the options were, although in retrospect it was quite a good choice.
And you got into Cambridge?
I got into Cambridge, yes, and studied mathematics. In retrospect, I feel I would have done better had I studied science, where in Cambridge you do a range of subjects, a broader education, but I did the mathematics tripos in Cambridge, and found myself quite good at maths, although I knew quite early in my undergraduate education that I wasn't cut out to be a real mathematician. There were some of my contemporaries who were. I enjoyed the problem-solving aspects and was quite good at it, but knew I wanted to do something else. And so in my final year in Cambridge, I shifted away from pure maths towards applications of maths. I didn't know what to do really, but I at one stage thought I would do economics. I had some friends and contemporaries who shifted from maths to economics, and I thought about it quite seriously. But I did manage, just by a bit of luck actually, to get a research studentship to stay in Cambridge. And my most important piece of good luck was being assigned to a very good supervisor called Dennis Sharma. Sharma, yes.
S-H-A-R-M-A.
S-C-I-A-M-A.
Yes.
And although when I started my PhD project I had no idea of whether I would be suited to it or whether I would enjoy the subject, within a year he had got me enthusiastic, and I was convinced that it was something I was going to be happy to be doing, at least for the PhD. And I was lucky at that stage, partly in having this very good supervisor, but partly also in my choice and timing of research topic, because this was 1964-65 when I started as a research student, and in the subject of astronomy and cosmology this was an important stage, because for the very first time there was discussion about whether black holes existed, whether the universe started with the Big Bang, etc. And so it was possible to follow developments which were, in retrospect, very important in the subject, and of course also in a subject where everything is new. The experience of old people is at a heavy discount, and it's possible when you're young to immediately start making contributions on a level with those who are more experienced. And so in that sense I was very lucky to start thinking about topics that were new, and where it was possible for a young person to quite quickly make original contributions.
And it was the time when radio astronomy was just beginning to really make a big mark.
Well, that's right, and Cambridge has been a big centre for radio astronomy over the last decade, and some of the first evidence against the famous steady state theory came from the radio astronomers in Cambridge, and also the first evidence that black holes existed in effect came from byproducts of the work they were doing. And so it was an exciting time, and I found that it suited my style of thinking, in that I'd never been all that good at long deductive chains of reasoning. I've always preferred a more sort of synthetic or synoptic style of thinking. And so what I liked doing at that stage was trying to make sense of some fragmentary and disconnected seeming data, and seeing if it fits into a pattern, seeing if we can explain it. And that actually is the theme of most of the work I've done ever since, trying to sort of make sense of data, being close to the observations and the phenomena, but trying to apply what I know of the theory to make sense of it.
This was the time when Jocelyn Bell was and Anthony Hewish were discovering pulsars and so on.
That's right. It was the radio astronomy group, which I was not a member of. I was in a group that was at that stage part of the applied maths department, but I had close links with the group in radio astronomy. I went to their seminars, and I knew the students who were my contemporaries, like Jocelyn Bell, so I was very much involved in talking to them. The discovery of pulsars, which you mentioned, came in 1968. I remember actually I was by then a recent graduate. I was spending a few months at Caltech as a visiting postdoc, and I remember Dennis Sharma writing me an AMA letter to tell me about this important seminar that Hewish had given, of course very different from the emails we'd have today with instant communication. But I remember being the first person at Caltech to hear about this exciting discovery via a letter from Dennis Sharma reporting a colloquium which Tony Hewish had given.
It happened in my room in the Department of Social Anthropology, and in the room where it...
indeed, because the radio astronomy group was, before the new Cavendish was built,
that's right.
in that area. Yes.
The very room. There's not even a single mark to indicate it,
yes.
but I know. Were there any astronomers, I mean, there are famous people like Fred Hoyle and so on, were there any astronomers in the world who, at that time, you really modelled yourself on in any way or admired greatly?
Well, Dennis Sharma was a very fine role model. He was a very articulate person who had broad interests within and beyond science, and he was very good at being positive about one's work and giving encouragement. And he also happened to have a good set of students, Hawking, Carter, Rowan Robinson, and a number of others, and we all learned from each other as well as from him, and it was a lively atmosphere. So he was the most important influence. Fred Hoyle was actually still around, but at this stage Fred Hoyle was a rather isolated figure because of internal departmental disputes, and so it was Dennis Sharma who took all the students. That's why Stephen Hawking and I and others were students of Dennis Sharma. I only really got to know Fred Hoyle later, because in 1967, which was the year I got my PhD, Fred Hoyle opened a separate institute which was separate from the maths department, and actually offered me a job as a postdoc in that department, and so I got to know him from then onwards. But as a scientific mentor, he was never as important as Sharma, because although Fred Hoyle was a unique figure in the subject, and for 25 years, from the 1940s to the early 60s, he was probably the person in the world who contributed most in terms of original ideas to astrophysics. He was, by the time I came into his orbit, becoming a slightly isolated and eccentric figure, cut off from the mainstream. And so, although I had a lot of social contact with him, he was never an intellectual mentor, and it was already clear that he was becoming rather isolated in his views from the mainstream, because he was not interacting very much with the younger people.
Was he a Yorkshireman?
He was a real Yorkshireman, yes.
Rather forthright, bluff
Indeed,
Yorkshireman.
yes, yes. And I think an extremely warm character who I admired very much, and I kept up with him until his death. In fact, in 1972, he resigned rather prematurely from Cambridge, and I, who was by then a young professor at Sussex, was appointed as his successor. So that's brought me back to Cambridge, having been at Sussex briefly. And I always appreciated the fact that Fred Hoyle always supported me and had helped me in my career, even though I had been writing papers contradicting his preferred theory. I mean, he was never reconciled to the Big Bang. He believed in the steady state. In later life, he compromised and believed in some sort of steady bang theory, but he never really appreciated the kind of work that I and others were doing. But nonetheless, in personal terms, he was very supportive, and I know that he was not unhappy that I had been appointed to the chair after he resigned.
As we go through, and you mention names, I sometimes pick them up, and one who viewers would love to hear more about is Stephen Hawking, who you are more or less a contemporary with.
Yes.
Is there anything you'd like to say about?
Well, indeed, and Stephen was 2 years ahead of me, in that when I joined Dennis Sharma's research group, Stephen was in his third year, and of course his disease had already started. He was hovering around on sticks at that stage, and Dennis Sharma told me that it was not clear he would finish his PhD at the time that he was taking on as a research student. And it was astonishing, of course, that he did finish a PhD, and well, we never predicted his future career. And in fact, if we sort of fast forward to recent times, I attended his 60th birthday conference, and was at more recent events 40 years later. And although as astronomers we're used to very large numbers, fewer as large as the odds I'd then have given back in the 1960s, again celebrating Stephen's achievements 40 years later.
And he's remained a friend.
Oh, indeed, yes. Yes. In terms of work, our scientific interests have slightly diverged, in that my work has been more closely linked to observations, whereas he has gradually moved away to more sort of speculative areas. And so, in terms of research, we've never really been collaborators, but I've certainly followed with admiration and interest all he's done ever since, and remained in contact, obviously.
You've written a number of popular books on the borders of your subject, and Stephen wrote a very famous bestseller. Did his short history of time influence you to try popular science writing, or had you already decided to do so before?
I don't think so. I didn't really get into it till later. I mean, I think his book was an extraordinary phenomenon. To be honest, as a book, it wasn't particularly good. There were a number of better books, but of course it made an immense impact, because Stephen himself was such an amazing figure, both scientifically and as an example of triumph over the odds. So it was that fascination that the public had with him, more than the intrinsic qualities of the book, which made the book such a phenomenal bestseller. But it did do a great deal of good for the subject, obviously, because apart from the work of Carl Sagan, which produced an even greater worldwide impact, Stephen made the widest impact of professional scientists involved in astronomy and cosmology, and made people realise that these subjects were of interest. And it seems to me, and that's one reason why I've done some popularising myself, that although the details of the subject are rather arcane and technical, it is possible to put over the concepts to a general readership without too much elaboration and without too much distortion either. So I think it is possible to convey the ideas devoid of too many technicalities in a way that can be understood by people. And of course, it's gratifying that a wide public is fascinated. I'd certainly derive less satisfaction from my own work if I felt that it was only something I could discuss with a few colleagues. And it's therefore a plus that there is a wider public which is interested in these questions. And, of course, if you look at what the wide public is interested in, they focus on the most fundamental questions of origins. Origin of life, origin of consciousness, and origin of the universe. Those are the topics on which there's the largest flow of generally rather good popular books. And so that indicates that the public is concerned with this. And I think it's a real plus that in subjects like mine that have no direct practical relevance, one does get through to this wider public. And that work is part of our culture. I mean, just as Darwin is part of everyday culture, I would say it's part of culture to understand the broader context in which we see the evolution of our universe, the amazing chain of events whereby from some mysterious beginning 14 billion years ago, atoms, stars, planets, biospheres, and eventually human brains able to wonder about it all have evolved. And I think that's something which you're culturally deprived if you have no awareness of. And I'm glad to be one of the people who's able to try and convey these ideas to a wide audience. It's also, I think, good for professional scientists, whatever field they're in, to speak to people outside their special expertise. The reason for that is that if you're a scientist, then of course it's part of your professional skill to focus on bite-sized problems that you think you can solve. And that often means, of course, focusing on what may seem a rather piddling or trifling problem, because the big problem can only be solved piecemeal or is premature for a frontal attack. But the occupational risk, therefore, of being a scientist is that you become so engrossed in the fascination of your specific minor problem that you forget the big picture, and you forget that your problem's only worth solving insofar as it helps to illuminate the big picture. And when you talk to a general audience, then the questions they ask are the big questions. And that reminds you that those big questions are the important ones, and makes you see your own minor contributions to the overall pattern in a true proportion.
That's very nice. I agree, absolutely. On the simplifying, one of my favourite quotes from Einstein is, you should make things as simple as possible, but not simpler.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's very important. Yes.
But not simpler.
Yes, because there are some concepts which are very hard to appreciate without the mathematical language which most people don't have.
Because the short history of time, I've got it, and like many readers, I started to read it and I couldn't. It doesn't make it very simple. I mean, it's quite a complex book, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, as I said, that it's probably not the best book on the subject. There are other books that have done a better job. But I think there is a mistake which many writers make when they write about science, and that is to assume that by eschewing mathematics, you make it accessible. And you don't, because there may be an unfamiliar vocabulary. Worse still, there can be familiar words being used in specialised senses, which can be very confusing to the general reader. And so I think one has to work very hard in order to present the work in a way that will be understood by someone who doesn't already have the vocabulary or is familiar with the concepts. And also, sometimes people use metaphors which seem rather clever to the insiders, but which don't really make sense unless you really know the stuff yourself. And so there are all kinds of pitfalls, and that makes me admire very much those people who do nonetheless do a successful job in conveying the essence of science to a general readership. And also I admire journalists, because they, of course, don't write careful books, but I know how hard it is to explain in simple language even something I think I understand fairly well. And the journalist, of course, has to describe something which may be unfamiliar to them and do this to a tight deadline. And I think that's a very difficult art. So I think scientists should not be in any sense snooty about those who do the popularising and interpreting, because that's a skill in its own right.
Do you test your books out? I find when I'm writing for general audiences, it's very helpful to give one or two of the members of that class a draft so that I can see what they can't understand.
Yes, well, I ought to. I have to admit I don't do that, and that's simply because of embarrassment. I'm always terribly embarrassed about my work, and I'm very reluctant to show it to people, and rather worry when it does appear in public. So that's one thing which I haven't done enough. And as you will know, if you've written books recently, the amount of editorial attention one gets from the publisher is far less than one is told it used to be. And so only in one case have I had anything beyond routine copy editing from any of my editors. And so I think I've made a mistake actually in not making more effort to
find ordinary readers.
Informal criticism from readers. Although most of my writing, indeed all my books, have really stemmed from lecture notes or articles. I mean, I'm not a natural writer. I would never sit down from scratch and write a book with a pile of blank sheets of paper in front of me. So what's happened really is that I have done quite a lot of general lecturing. I've written quite a few articles, and having done that, I felt it worth the extra investment of trying to synthesize these into a fairly coherent story in hardcovers. So my books have really not been things where I start at the beginning and finish at the end. They're things where I've tried to mesh together some earlier writings or fragments that I've prepared in order not to waste them, as it were.
I guess you enjoy lecturing.
Well, it's interesting. I don't enjoy lecturing. To adapt what Dorothy Parker said about writing, she said she didn't enjoy writing but enjoyed having written. I perhaps enjoy having lectured if I feel it's gone all right. I don't like lecturing, I don't like writing. The one thing I do like is preparing lectures, in that I like trying to think of how the ideas knit together and how you can best explain them by ordering them and putting in analogies. So I enjoy writing notes for lectures I'm going to give. I don't enjoy giving the lecture. I don't enjoy writing a full text afterwards. But the one thing I do enjoy is actually doing the preparation and seeing how the ideas fit together. And I enjoy also informal discussions about my work.
Let's come back to your life. You had done your PhD and you then went straight to Sussex, or?
No, in fact, when I got my PhD, I got a research fellowship first at Jesus College, but almost immediately went off to the United States for short spells. I was very lucky to get a research fellowship which gave me sort of 3-year horizon in Cambridge, and that level of security. And then I did something which in retrospect I think was a good idea, which is that I went for 6 months to California, to Caltech, then came back, and then went for 6 months to Princeton, and then came back. And so I got some varied experience without feeling worried that I was going to be out of a job. So I was lucky to have that opportunity. And then I had a base in Cambridge, which continued a bit longer. And then in 1972, I moved to Sussex University as a professor. At that time, I had no expectation I'd come back to Cambridge at all. I remember throwing away my gown, thinking I'd never wear such a garment again. But as it turned out, it was only a year before Fred Hoyle resigned unexpectedly from his chair in Cambridge, and I was appointed to succeed him, and then came back. And I've been based in Cambridge in various capacities ever since. That's ever since 1973.
Well, that raises the question of why you didn't stay or go to the States, because when you went to Princeton, was it the institute you went to, or?
Yes, I went as a postdoc to the Institute of Advanced Study, and I've frequently visited there in later years, and I'm now on the Board of Trustees, so it's a place I'm very familiar with.
But I've asked other distinguished scientists who have stayed in Cambridge why often people say there are better resources and you're better paid and so on in America. Why did you not go there, do you think? Push or pull?
Well, I think I've been lucky in that for my subjects, Cambridge has been a strong centre, and I think I've done my bit to help to keep it that way, and I think we are still a major centre for my subject, and I certainly don't feel I could have done my work any better anywhere else. And certainly, having visited most of the major centres in the US, I haven't found any place that offers the combination which Cambridge does of the good departmental structure in very nice surroundings, which we have at the Astronomy Institute, plus the extra dimension of colleges and interdisciplinary contact, plus the general ambience and the community and the aesthetic background. If you transplanted King's College Chapel to California, I might be slightly less reluctant to go, but there's nowhere else I've met within the States which has that combination of attractivenesses which it seems to me Cambridge possesses, and so I've never felt at all attracted to the United States, quite apart from one's uneasiness about becoming a US citizen.
Talking about interdisciplinary, certainly for some of the sciences and even some of the arts and humanities, the fact that you are in an environment where colleges mix you together, and it's very easy to meet and work with people in neighbouring disciplines, whereas this isn't always the case in all universities. Has that been at all important in your subject?
Well, it's been important in my life. I'm not sure so much in my subject, because what I think is very important is that you should interact with the community in your subject. And I think the department I'm in, the Institute of Astronomy, which I was director of for a long time, is well known for a very sort of interactive and informal atmosphere where everyone gets together for coffee, everyone works with their doors open, everyone wanders in and out, and lots of visitors come and go, etc. And that, I think, makes a stimulating atmosphere, and I think it's very important indeed, especially for young people, to be in the atmosphere where you meet the senior people, you don't have to go and knock on their door, they're always there for coffee, etc. And so I think that aspect has been very important. The contact with people in other departments and other spheres has been very important for my sort of personal education and broadening. And it's been a great privilege, because I was a head of King's for a very long time, to have the chance to get to know people like Sidney Brenner, Frank Commode, and Dan Mackenzie, and people like that, who are leaders in their subjects. And to do that even when you're a young person, because in an American university, you are in a possibly very good department, but unless you're a department chairman or dean or something like that, then you won't routinely meet people from other departments in the same way as we do in the Cambridge system, where each college is a microcosm of the university. And so that means that even the younger faculty in the university are embedded in this cross-disciplinary atmosphere. And I think it's valuable not just socially, it's valuable intellectually, and also I found it helped me very much when I was a young professor to be involved, for instance, in selecting college research fellows, where you try to compare people across different subjects and to actually get a feel at an early stage for the different criteria and the different standards and different value systems across the whole of academic subjects. I found very helpful and very enlightening, and so that's something which you routinely get as a Cambridge academic, but is an experience that only senior people get in the US system.
You mentioned the chapel being exported to California,
Yes.
Which hasn't yet happened. No doubt there are replicas around the world,
Yes.
Beijing and elsewhere. But what else about King's? You were, like me, you've been a fellow for many years here. Were there any other people or things about King's that you'd like to put on record as you enjoyed?
Well, I think it was a group that contained a number of outstanding figures, but also had a social and convivial atmosphere, which I was privileged to be part of for a long time. And I think that exemplifies what you do find in Cambridge. I wouldn't say King's was unique, but certainly I was privileged to be within King's. And of course, it is famous in the world for the chapel more than for anything else. I mean, to us in the college itself, it doesn't seem that way. The chapel seems a sort of slightly arm's length appendage, to mix the metaphors. But I certainly think that the excellence displayed by what goes on in a chapel is an important feature of the college, and certainly one of my happiest experiences while in King's was often walking through the college at night when someone's playing the organ in the chapel, and the whole thing is like some huge musical instrument, you know, and that's a wonderful experience which you get, and you don't get that in many other places.
So what do you get in Trinity? I mean, you've had the chance now as Master of Trinity to
Yes.
compare two colleges.
Yes, yes.
What are the sort of deeper differences between them, do you think?
I would say the similarities greatly outweigh the differences. It's a larger and somewhat more formal structure, but basically it's very much the same. The chapel is not quite so spectacular, although one thing that we do have is outstanding music, very outstanding choir, and so the chapel is important there too. But I think the similarities greatly outweigh the differences.
Now, how have you found being master? I mean, from one account you've made quite a lot of changes, but done it so well that no one has really realised what you've been doing. Have you enjoyed being master?
I think the master in Trinity is even more non-executive than the master of most other colleges, in that there's a very large fellowship with a very, very strong commitment to the college. And one thing that's impressed me hugely is the willingness of the fellows to devote time to the college, and there's never a difficulty in finding people to be tutors and take on other roles like that. There's a tremendous willingness to work for the college. And this, of course, means that the master is very non-executive and not so hands-on, perhaps, as in a smaller college. But certainly it's been a great privilege.
I noticed you didn't say whether you'd enjoyed it, but perhaps enjoy is the wrong word
Yes.
that want to apply to such a job.
Well, I think I do enjoy it. I mean, it turned out that a year after I was appointed Master of Trinity, I was appointed President of the Royal Society, which is another great privilege and quite a time-consuming one, which involves 2 or 3 days a week in London and other opportunities. And I think, if I were completely honest, had I known I was going to take on the Royal Society, I probably would not have agreed to do Trinity, because although they are both very privileged positions, it's hard to feel you're doing them both adequately and leaving enough time for other things.
Well, we had a provost who was also trying to do both, Pat Bateson, who was also, he wasn't president, but he was senior executive, and
Right.
it was clearly very difficult. But on the Royal Society, again, are there any things that, it's such a distinguished and ancient institution, are there any things that you'd like to say about being...
Well, the Royal Society actually is changing a lot and is concerned very much to look towards the future. In fact, one of the things that's keeping me especially busy in my role as President is that in the year 2010 we celebrate our 350th anniversary. And in connection with this, we are having a fundraising appeal for £100 million. We're trying to expand our policy activities, international links, etc., and also play a wider role. But I think what's already happening in the Royal Society, which makes the role fascinating, is that it is engaged with policy over a wider range of subjects than before, essentially because science and technology enter into a wider range of government policies. I mean, over the whole environmental, energy, climate change, health agendas, clearly science is very important. And as the UK's indeed the Commonwealth's Academy of Sciences, we in the Royal Society feel we want to maximise our impact on decision making to ensure that decisions are made on the basis of the best available scientific evidence. And also the international aspect of our work has expanded. We have links obviously with academies of other countries, the National Academy of Sciences in the US and others, and a lot of our work is on intrinsically international issues like pandemics and climate change, etc. And one thing which started just 3 years ago was a routine meeting of the academies of the G8 countries in the lead up to the G8 summit. This happened first in 2005 when the UK had the presidency. It happened just this last year when Germany had the presidency, and the aim is for the academies of the G8 to do G8 plus 5, because we bring in India, China, Brazil, Mexico and South Africa as well. Those academies make unanimous and not entirely platitudinous statements, and that I think is important. It's important that the academies can agree on these matters, and important that this feeds into the G8 summit. Obviously, it's only one of the inputs, but this year Chancellor Merkel had a separate meeting with the heads of the academies, and we hope next year, when the Japanese have the presidency, that the same thing will happen. And so that's an example of how the Royal Society's activities have broadened in the international context. And so that's what we are trying to do. But I suppose, above all, the Royal Society is aimed at trying to maintain scientific excellence and support the quality of science, particularly in this country, which I think is crucial for this country, because we have an enviable tradition of scientific research, and dating indeed right back to the founders of the Royal Society in 1660, and to Newton, etc. And it's very important that we maintain our competitive edge in a world where the competition comes not just from the US, but from the Far East as well. If we don't, it's a poor show for maintaining the UK's prosperity. And we have a head start through our traditions in science. And I think it's very important that we do all we can to sustain those. And I think we're fortunate that the government has had not only positive rhetoric, but positive actions over the last 10 years towards this end. And I hope it remains that way. And I hope the Royal Society is going to be able to have an increasing impact on this sort of thing. And that by 2010, when we have our anniversary, the Royal Society will be as broadly involved in activities in science and politics as our founders were back in 1660, when they included in their members people like Christopher Wren and Samuel Pepys.
Robert Boyle.
Robert Boyle, yes.
You mentioned the Far East, and I'm very interested in Japan and China. China is obviously powering ahead now with its, certainly with its wealth. Have you been to China, and do you know anything about Chinese science now?
To my embarrassment, I've never been to China, although I hope to go in the next few months. I had yesterday an invitation to go in late October for the opening of the new UK science office out there. But I have been to Japan and India quite frequently. And I think we've got to realise that the intellectual capital of the world is going to be concentrated in Asia and not in Europe or the United States in the 21st century. That's where the population is concentrated, and it's a highly educated population now. And so the balance of intellectual effort is going to shift probably from Europe and the United States towards Asia, and therefore it's very important that we are mindful of that and adjust our policies in that context.
You mentioned that you had to set up relations with politicians, and I think you've also done a certain amount of work for the Labour Party. I mean, are you a Labour man, so to speak?
Well, I'm still a member of the Labour Party, and I was quite active in the campaign for the 1993 election. I always thought of myself as old Labour rather than new Labour, and so I haven't been so active politically. And I'm now in the House of Lords as a crossbencher at the moment.
Are you a crossbencher?
Yes.
What does that mean exactly for people watching this from Japan or whatever? What is a crossbencher? It's someone who...
Well, someone without party affiliation. And in the House of Lords at the moment there are people who are appointed as so-called working peers by the main parties, but it's also, it has been just for the last 6 or 7 years or so, a separate system whereby people are nominated after interview as crossbenchers,
Mm.
who are people who are supposed to bring some expertise and commitment to the place, but you don't participate as a member of a political party. And I'm in that category.
How much time does the House of Lords take on top of it?
Well, I would like to be involved more because, unlike most scientists, I've always been fascinated by politics, and so I would like to become involved. At the moment, because of other commitments, I haven't been very active. I turn up whenever I can, but I don't feel I pull my weight adequately. I try and attend twice a week, but that may be a brief attendance.
Twice a week?
I would hope that when I complete my other activities, I will become more involved. What's frustrating now is that often there are debates or activities I'd like to participate in, but they're scheduled at short notice, and because you're doing other things, you can't be there. So I can't participate in the way that the so-called working peers do. But I hope that within a few years I will be able to participate more. It's certainly a great privilege to be there.
Returning to your work, I heard about a conference which was, I think, in honour of your 60th birthday, in which there were 10 themes, which most people could only understand one or two of them, I'm told, but they all believed that you could understand what was going on in all of them. Whether that's true, I won't ask you, but could you sort of outline 2 or 3 of the main thrusts of your work, and very simply for...
Yes. Well, I think my works all involve trying to use the physics that we understand to make sense of what's out there, and how everything evolved from some mysterious beginning into the cosmos that we see around us and of which we are a part. And I suppose, compared to most people in my subjects, worked on a fairly broad front. The subject is now subdivided into specialities, and some people are involved in only one, whereas I have tried to remain involved in several, and I think there are sort of 2 or 3 areas that I'm still active in, and that I go to conferences on 2 or 3 areas. And one of them is trying to understand how the universe changed from being a sort of hot, dense, amorphous gas, which it was in the first million years after the Big Bang, to its present state, when it's very diffuse, full of stars, galaxies, etc., and trying to understand how the first galaxies and stars formed, what they were like, how we can use observations to learn something about this, and to test our theories, and to see which of the various conflicting theories is closest to the truth. So to understand cosmic evolution from an amorphous beginning to present structures, and why galaxies exist, why they're the way they are, etc. That's one theme. The second theme of my work has been really to understand extreme phenomena in the universe, because another reason why we do astronomy is because nature has performed experiments we can never perform in the lab. Extremes of gravity, extremes of temperature and energy, etc. And so by looking at things happening in space, you can perhaps learn something about the laws of nature under extreme conditions which you could never simulate here on Earth. And that lends added interest to those phenomena. And I've done quite a lot of work, particularly in the last 10 years, on some of the most extreme phenomena, things called gamma ray bursts, which are objects which explode and release in a fraction of a second more power than the sun puts out over its entire 10 billion year lifetime, and put these out in a flash of gamma rays. And this is a process which involves huge energies, particles moving at nearly the speed of light, and probably the formation of a black hole, and other exotica. And so by trying to make sense of this, and I say we haven't got very far yet, but trying to make sense of it, one hopes not only to understand phenomena which are fascinating in their own right, but also perhaps get clues to the nature of matter under extreme conditions, to our theories of black holes, etc. So that's one set of ideas I'm involved in now. So the 2 main areas are how structures originate in the universe, and how we can learn from the most extreme phenomena in the present day universe, more about the laws of nature and about gravity. I also do some more speculative things about the nature of the laws of nature themselves, and is the part of the universe we can observe most of physical reality or just some tiny fragment of it? Could there be other big bangs apart from ours, etc.? And so those are more speculative things that I work on in my off-duty moments, as it were.
Lovely. There's a quotation in the book you edited on the universe by Stephen Hawking, something like, "It is not implausible to believe that we may be on the edge of understanding the underlying and unifying laws of nature and the universe." Seemed rather hopeful statement.
Well, it is hopeful. I think it's good that some people are hopeful, because that motivates them to try hard to look for them. And unless you try hard, you certainly won't find those laws. But I think there's a very interesting question of whether we will, in the next few decades, complete the program we'd started with Newton and continued with Maxwell and Einstein of trying to unify together the different forces of nature, electricity, magnetism, nuclear forces, gravity, etc. And some people are hopeful, some are less hopeful. And so this search for a fundamental theory, a unified theory, is an important goal of science. I'd like to say two things about it. First, it could be that there is such a theory, but we'll never have it because it's beyond human brains. There's no particular reason to believe that human brains are matched to the understanding of the deepest level of physical reality. Just like my dog can't understand quantum theory, so it could be that humans can't understand the deepest theories needed to explain physical reality. So we've got to accept that there may be a theory, but it may be beyond us. We may have to await post-humans rather than humans, as it were. So that's one thing. But the second point, which is often misunderstood, is that if we had such a theory, it would be the end of a certain style of science, but it would not in any sense be the end of science. That's because most of scientists are trying to understand phenomena in the everyday world, which are difficult because they're very complicated. And they're held up, if they're chemists or biologists or ecologists, by the complexity of what they're studying. None of those scientists I mentioned are held up in the slightest through not understanding what happens deep inside an atomic nucleus. That's irrelevant. They're trying to understand what happens when atoms are packed together in the big concatenations that make living organisms. And so that's the complication for them. And so the unified theory, if it exists and if we find it, will be an important step forward in the program that goes back to Newton to unify the laws of nature, because Newton, after all, was the first unifying that he showed that the force that holds the moon in its orbit is the same one that makes the apple fall and holds us to the ground. And so it will be the end of that program. But although it will also unify the physics of the very small, quantum theory, and the physics of the very large, gravity and Einstein's theory, there's a third frontier in science. They're very complicated. And the most complicated things are neither as small as atoms nor as large as stars. They're things like us. And the greatest challenge to science is going to be to understand the very complex.
Thank you very much for that. I don't think there's a natural bridge to God, but we might move on to him. There's quite a lot of speculation now, Richard Dawkins and others, about the existence or non-existence or provability or what of God, and I know that you've spoken about your views on this subject from time to time. What is your current feeling about having gazed deep into...
Well, my views are very moderate and therefore very dull, in the sense that if science teaches me anything relevant to religion, it teaches me that even something as simple as an atom is pretty hard for most of us to understand. And that makes me very suspicious of anyone who claims to have anything more than a very incomplete and metaphorical view of any deep aspect of reality. So that makes me sceptical of, and indeed allergic to, claims to reveal dogmatic truths about matters of importance. And so I could never be a firm adherent of any dogmatic religious belief. Nonetheless, I believe in peaceful coexistence between mainstream religion and science, and I myself, having grown up in the tradition of the Church of England, see that the customs of my tribe, as it were, are customs that are part of my culture, part of my country's culture, and which have tremendous aesthetic resonance for me and social resonance. And so I'm very happy to participate in the rituals of the Church of England. And so I do attend my college chapel, as it were. And I do this because I believe it's important. I would be sad to see it decline. But I fully accept that if I had been born not in this country but in Iran, I'd be going to the mosque in the same spirit. And so I don't believe in any sort of absolutism. I accept it's culturally conditioned, but nonetheless I accept it as important. And I also feel slightly allergic to strident atheism, which I believe could be counterproductive for two reasons. First, I believe that fundamentalism is a threat to all of us. And this fundamentalism is of various kinds. It's the fundamentalism of the American Deep South and of Islamic fundamentalism. It's also the fundamentalism of crazy New Age sects who may talk the language of science but are cut off from any rationality and could be dangerous. So there's fundamentalism of all kinds, and I think we need all the allies we can get against it. And they include, I would say, mainstream religion, who we should have on the same side as those who are more agnostic. And I also think that we should emphasize that it's possible to practice a religion and be a scientist as well. And otherwise we will harm science, because if you were a sixth former in a British school and are a devout Muslim, and someone comes and tells you that you can't believe in Darwin and in your God, then you're going to choose your God and be lost to science. And I think that's bad for science and bad for all of us. And so I think to preach the possibility of coexistence between science and religion is something which I wish to do. And I think to do otherwise is going to be bad for society, that we'll weaken our stand against fundamentalism, and I would say bad for science and culture, because it will mean that people who would otherwise like to participate in science as a world culture will be deterred from doing so.
Thank you. I've just got two more questions. One is how you manage to do all that you manage to do. The catalogue, I haven't gone through all the other things you do, but basically you not only answer my emails immediately and have long conversations with my friends, they tell me as if there was nothing else in the world for you to do, but you managed to have this interview. How do you organise your life to manage to do research and administer and be calm and relaxed? Some tips for us.
Well, I'm not sure I do succeed in those goals you mentioned. Two things. I think one thing that we all have to learn, and many academics are rather bad at this, is not to be too much of a perfectionist. And we all know that if we devoted more time, we could make our lectures better. If we devoted more time to polishing a paper, we'd make the paper better, etc. But we've got to learn to maximise the sum of several terms, and not to maximise each one. And I think many people aren't very good at this, and they will be ultra-perfectionist, and they'll spend too much time on one thing and therefore make less contribution if they'd done more things less well, as it were. So you've got to, I think, accept that you're doing everything less well than you could if you did it to the exclusion of everything else. And so I try to do that and to balance my efforts. But I think also I'm quite lucky in that I intrinsically have a short attention span. So that whereas some people can only work if they are uninterrupted for several hours, I tend to get bored fairly quickly, and perhaps can use my time more efficiently if I then turn to some other kind of work rather than switching off completely. I should say that some kinds of research which I haven't done successfully, which do require very long uninterrupted times. For instance, preparing very elaborate computer codes or something, which I've never done and wouldn't be no good at. They do require uninterrupted time, but the kind of work I've done can be achieved without very long uninterrupted times. And so I've always worked in fits and starts and being more tolerant of interruptions to other people. And that's perhaps made it possible for me to divide my time into small chunks more easily than some people can, but certainly my research is cut down greatly, and my popular writing is very much on hold at the moment. I missed the deadline for a popular book recently.
Finally, if you had to give a couple of sentences of advice to a young graduate starting out in science now, because we've only got a minute and a half, but is there anything you would advise them to think about and do?
Well, of course, the risk is if a young scientist looks at all the journals on the shelves, etc., think that all the big problems have been solved. And the important point to make firstly to young people is that if you are doing a scientific problem, you're not doing the problems that earlier people got stuck on. You're addressing questions that couldn't even have been posed 20 years ago. As science advances, the periphery gets longer, but the frontier of new topics comes into focus. And so you want to choose a subject where things are advancing fast, where there are new problems that couldn't have been posed 10 years ago, and also when there are new techniques, more powerful computers, more powerful instruments, etc., so that you can have access to data that your predecessors didn't. And then you can make a contribution without being in any sense cleverer than the old guys. You've got to do something which is new and which the older generation never had a chance to do. That's one bit of advice. But the other bit of advice I'd give is if you really want to do something, don't be deterred by negative advice from old professors like myself.
That's a lovely point to end on. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Martin Rees, who I first heard about in the fellowship electors when I was on in 1973. And I think it was Nick Jardine said, Martin Rees has just been elected. We must have him at King's. He is a very notable scientist. And so for 34 years, roughly, I've known Martin, and it's a great honour and privilege to have a chance to talk to him. Martin, when were you born and where?
I was born in 1942, and I was born in York, but I should say I'm not a Yorkshireman really. My family and my upbringing was in the Welsh border country, and I was born in York because my father was doing his basic Air Force training at some camp near York, and so by coincidence we happened to be there for the year. But after I was 1 year old, my mother and father moved back to North Wales, and then I was afterwards brought up mainly in Shropshire, just on the borders of Radnorshire.
Tell me something about your parents and how they influenced you.
My parents were both school teachers. In fact, they met when they were both teaching at the same private school in the late 1930s. My father was a Cambridge graduate in English and taught in secondary schools and later in the Teachers Training College. And my wife was trained as a primary school teacher.
Okay. We'll go from your mother. And your mother?
Yes. And my mother was trained as a primary school teacher, and she taught in a variety of schools, and in fact just after World War II she briefly ran a small primary school herself. But my earliest firm memories really date from 1948, because in that year my parents decided rather boldly that they would start their own school, a vaguely progressive boarding school, and they rented a very large but somewhat run-down mansion in South Shropshire, and we moved there, and they opened this school, which is still going, and my early schooling and my early life was in these rather beautiful surroundings of the hills of South Shropshire in a very small village.
Tell me something about the character of your parents. Were they nice to you?
I got a great deal of personal attention as an only child, and particularly in my first few years when my mother was looking after me. I must have had a tremendous amount of personal attention, and my parents were extremely supportive, and I obviously derived far more education from them than from anyone else for my first 12 years of life, I'm sure. My father in particular was an extremely versatile and talented man who painted, composed and wrote, was interested in politics, etc. And so I think I learned a great deal from him. as well as from the formal education I had at that time. And I went until the age of 13 to this school which my parents ran. At the age of 13, it was really a choice. I could either go to Ludlow Grammar School, which was the nearest grammar school, which was a 14-mile bus ride away, or be sent as a boarder to Shrewsbury School, which was 30 miles away. And my parents chose the latter, so I went from the age of 13 to this boarding school.
I'd always wondered why you chose Ludlow as your title in the House of Lords, but that's because of this upbringing there.
That's right. The village we lived in was deep in the country, but Ludlow was the nearest market town, and so it's something that was part of my childhood and is, apart from that, a very beautiful small town.
Thank you very much. Gabriel Horn and Pat Bateson. I tried Einstein's famous remark that unless an idea starts off as absurd, there's no hope for it. And they looked very puzzled. They said, that's not how our science works. We work from known facts, and maybe that's how mathematicians and physicists work, but not us. But when I tried this line on Sidney Brenner, he immediately said, yes, most of my ideas, and he's written about this, start off as half right and half wrong, and then gradually, through conversations and evidence, I improve them until they work, but many of them are pretty crazy. How does it work with you, Martin?
Well, most ideas start off being rather fragile and vulnerable, so you have to protect them a bit before you jettison them. But I think philosophers of science sometimes get a wrong impression, influenced by Thomas Kuhn, who emphasised the idea of science proceeding by normal routes and the occasional revolution. I think there's only been one or two revolutions in the Kuhnian sense over the whole history of physical science. Most new ideas in science don't overthrow the old ideas. They transcend and generalise them. For instance, Einstein didn't really overthrow Newton. He extended Newton's laws so that they applied more widely for high speeds and for strong gravity, etc. He gives a deeper understanding into why gravity worked the way it did. But he didn't overthrow Newton. Newton is still very viable and is the way we do calculations for spacecraft, etc. And I think in almost all the cases I know about, the advances in science have really transcended and subsumed what went before. Very seldom does one really have to wipe the slate completely clean and start again. So science is really evolutionary procedure, and in most cases, in the subjects I've worked on, it's been led not so much by brilliant ideas, but by new observations, which in turn are made possible by technical advances. And certainly, in my subject, 95% of the credit should go to those who've developed new technologies, allowing new kinds of observations or experiments to be carried out. And that leads to new ideas, new thoughts, new things to interpret, and that, as I mentioned already, is a reason why young people don't have to batter their brains out trying to solve what older guys fail to solve. They can think about new things or use new techniques. So I think that is the nature of ideas, that they evolve and they develop, and one tries to fit some new pieces of the jigsaw to generalise it or complete it, rather than overthrowing everything and starting again. Of course, there are key insights that one has, and the most important developments in science do involve some new idea which is a new unifying idea which links together lots of unrelated thoughts. Dan Mackenzie was involved in such an idea, continental drift and tectonics, that unified lots of data, and there have been some ideas like that in my subject where you try and piece together some superficially unrelated data into one framework. Of course, the other big contrast between science and the humanities as regards creativity is that although in science your work is durable, it generally loses identity. You add your brick to the corpus of public knowledge, but in general, if you had not been there, then that brick would have been provided by someone else, generally pretty soon. Einstein is perhaps the only 20th century scientist who really made a distinctive imprint, in that had he not existed, some of his ideas might have not emerged for decades and by a different route. But in most cases, individuals play an only marginal role in that what they discovered would have been discovered by someone else. I think the nicest way of putting this is in one of Medawar's marvellous essays, when he points out that when Wagner took 10 years off in the middle of the Ring cycle to compose Tristan and Götterdämmerung, he wasn't worried that someone would scoop him on. Sorry, I said that wrong.
Say it again.
Yes. When
Well,
Wagner
let's. Okay.
Yes, one of the most memorable statements about creativity in Sounds and Humanities is in one of Peter Medawar's marvellous essays, where he points out that when Wagner took 10 years off in the middle of the Ring cycle to compose Meisterstan, he wasn't concerned that someone would scoop him on Götterdämmerung. Whereas if you are a scientist, if you are Watson and Crick, for instance, and you've taken 10 years off, someone else would have done a double helix. So in science, very rarely does any individual advance the subject by more than a few years compared to what would have happened had they not existed. But that doesn't diminish the satisfaction you get if you feel you have had an idea that has been vindicated.
You said that there were a couple of Kuhnian revolutions. The example Kuhn, of course, concentrates on in his famous essay is Galileo and Copernicus. Is that one of them?
That is one, and I think probably another one is the quantum revolution in the early 20th century, because obviously the concepts of quantum theory were completely counterintuitive and were completely different from the mechanistic view. Of course, we do now realise that they are consistent with it, and it's only when you get down to the micro world that these counterintuitive, spooky elements of quantum theory come in. But I would say that was such a remarkable conceptual innovation that it does count as a Kuhnian moment, as it were. Incidentally, that really leads to one of the other things that I marvel about when I do my own science, which is how far we can get with common sense intuitions. The fact that our brains, which coped to deal with the everyday experience of our ancestors, can go so far in interpreting phenomena far, far beyond the experience of our ancestors. But we should not therefore be surprised that we can't extrapolate indefinitely. When you get down to the world of the quantum, then you can't use the everyday concepts of mechanics, and similarly when you get up to the realm of the entire universe, again ideas of space and time that we've grown up with have need modification. But I think the remarkable thing is not that we have to develop new intuitions for the extremes of the very large and the very small, but that our brains and our intuitions have been so successful in making sense of the physical world.
Could you say something more personal about how you yourself work? I mean, do you tend to think first and do experiments later, or how?
Well, my work has been what I call phenomenology, in that although I'm a theorist trying to make sense of data and develop ideas, I've been in very close contact with the observations. And I think the distinctive contributions I've made have been through adopting a fairly synoptic or synthetic style of thinking and trying to link together unrelated data obtained by different techniques, maybe optical telescopes, radio telescopes, spacecraft, etc., and trying to see if they fit into a pattern. So I've been always in close touch with data, but trying to make sense of them by applying the physics I understand. It's rather like if you're an engineer and you're told to use your knowledge to construct something to meet certain specifications, you do your best, and sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. So what I'm doing is trying to use the laws of nature as I understand them to make sense of some phenomena. And I've done this through most of my career. In fact, when I started off, the first evidence was coming for the Big Bang origin of our universe and for black holes, etc. And I felt I was very lucky in that that was a good time to be starting as a research student when there were these new ideas. It was possible to have fairly naive thoughts which were nonetheless novel. But what's been very fortunate is that my subject has not stagnated, and that, again, largely through the developments of technology that have continued, the rate of discoveries has remained very high. And if I look at what's happened in the most recent 5 years, then the pace of discovery has been at least as high as it was in the late 1960s when I began. In these last few years, for the first time, discovered a new force that is pushing the expansion of the universe and making it accelerate. We've learned a good deal more about the very first incipient stages of how galaxies and stars form in the universe. And also we've discovered for the first time that our solar system is far from unique, and that there are orbiting many other stars, systems of planets, some of which may be rather like our solar system. That's an entirely new subject, which is made possible by being able to detect very small motions in a star, which are manifestations of the pull exerted by a planet orbiting around it. And that's opened up an entirely new subject. And 20 years from now, I think it'll be fascinating to look up at the stars that we're familiar with and realise that each one of them has planets orbiting it, and be able to say what the properties of those planets are, just as we tell children now about the planets of our solar system. So that's an example of how the cosmos has become much more interesting as our body of data has been greatly enriched by new technologies.
One last question about working methods, right down to the nitty-gritty. Do you tend, you lead a very busy life, but you said you had a short attention span.
Mm-hmm.
Do you tend to sit and think, or do you tend to walk and think, or do you tend to write and think? Or how, in a day when you think you're being productive, what do you actually do?
Well, I sit and think, and often, of course, just sit. But I think I have benefited a great deal from working in collaboration. And that's not just for the cynical reason that the other guy does most of the work, although I'm afraid that's true more often than not. But I think it is very important to have someone with whom you can discuss the technical details of some issue in a way that the average person would not be interested in. But if you are working in collaboration, then that means not only do you hope to have someone with complementary expertise, but you hope also to have someone with whom you can discuss the details. And so I find that talking to people about ideas is something which I enjoy, and a lot of ideas do develop in that sort of way, through interaction, tossing ideas off one another. I think what I'm saying is quite a common experience among scientists. They do need to have a sounding board, as it were, and I've benefited from a whole succession of collaborators, colleagues and students, etc., working on different topics, and obviously sometimes they bring special expertise, and I often spend a lot of time talking to people who've made observations that I'm trying to make sense of, and I find the social side of science a very important part of it. And when one goes to conferences, of course, I think what's important is not only meeting the people, but also being able to calibrate how seriously you take them. I think, to make another cynical statement, I've spent a lot of time going to conferences, but often I've saved a lot of time by hearing some guy speak whose work I couldn't fully understand, and realising, having heard him, that it was not my fault that I couldn't understand him, and that I didn't try too hard. And so sometimes by getting the view of the community on a certain person's work, on a certain style of work, you help to decide how you can best use your time. And I therefore find that I seldom feel I've wasted my days when I go to a conference, because you do get a feeling for what the consensus is. Of course, the way we work now is very much affected by email and the internet. And I work with collaborators quite often by email, etc. But I think that only works if you've already met the people in real reality, as it were. You can then continue collaboration. But I think the real meeting is crucial, whether it's at a conference or at an institute. And I think that's very reassuring, because having spent a lot of my life at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge, which is one of the main centres in the world for this type of research, I'd be rather sad if the benefits of such an interactive institute were to become eroded by everyone just sitting there on email all the time. There is a tendency for that to happen, of course. I find lots of my colleagues are on email collaborating with someone else on a different continent, but I think the real contact is still very important.
You said that many discoveries were still being made. Talking to some physicists, I got the impression from them that they feel that physics, at least, is on some sort of plateau, and that given what is known and currently known, it's extremely difficult to see how it could develop much in the foreseeable future. But you don't feel that about your subject?
No, I think subnuclear physics is a subject which does depend on experiments that are very difficult to do, etc., and it has been held up for 20 years through a lack of new crucial experiments. There's hope for some advances in next year when the new accelerator at CERN in Geneva comes online. So there are hopes that will discover a new set of particles that are predicted but not yet discovered. But it's certainly true that in that subject things have stagnated rather, because there are lots of ideas but no way of testing them. But in a way that's the downside of a positive achievement, because it's a great achievement that particle physicists can understand everything that they observed, except things that need billion-dollar experiments to test. So that indicates that the subject has developed a certain maturity. I think there is an important point here to make, though, that that is only one branch of science, even only one branch of physics. Understanding the very, very smallest basic ingredients of matter is clearly important. That's fundamental in a sense. But it's very misleading to be unduly reductionist. People sometimes say, well, it's like a building when you've got particle physics at the bottom, then the rest of physics, then chemistry, then cell biology, then organisms, and then social science and the economists up in the penthouse. And you think there's a sort of hierarchy. But the analogy of the building is not a very good one, because in the case of a building, insecure foundations imperil the whole structure. But that's not the case in the hierarchy of the sciences. Biologists aren't impeded in the slightest by the fact we don't understand what goes on inside an atomic nucleus. They are impeded by the complexity of what they're trying to understand. So each science, each level in the hierarchy, has its own irreducible concepts and tries to interpret things in terms of those concepts. It may be true in principle that everything, including us, are solutions of Schrödinger's equations, but even if you could solve the equations, then that would not yield useful insight. You've got to solve the problems of each science in terms of that science's own concepts. And that therefore means that although understanding the subnuclear world is very important as a branch of science, it's not something which is important for the rest of science directly. So the rest of science is not being held up through not understanding subnuclear physics. Although there is one science which is held up, and that is understanding the very beginning of our universe. I work on how our universe evolved from simple beginnings to its present state, and we can extrapolate back with a good deal of confidence to when the universe was about a billionth of a second old. That may seem a pretty bold statement, but if you measure things on a log scale, a lot can happen in the first billionth of a second. And the reason that we can't understand that first tiny, tiny instant is that if our extrapolation backwards is correct, then conditions get more and more extreme as we extrapolate back to hotter and denser states. And the laws that we can test in the lab, the laws of physics that we feel we are confident about, break down and get transcended when you get back to this very early state, because the particles are all moving around with higher energies than we can produce even with the big accelerators at CERN. So right at the very beginning, then we need some new knowledge of fundamental physics. And there is this interesting link between the very large and the very small, because in most of science we are not impeded by the fact that there's no unification between the quantum world, which is the world of the atom, of the microscope, and the cosmic world, where gravity dominates. The reason for that is that in the case of single atoms and molecules, gravity is not an important force. Gravity is a tiny force between two atoms. Gravity is only important when you pack together huge numbers of particles. And so conversely, in the case of planets and stars, where gravity is a dominant force, quantum uncertainty isn't important. The quantum fuzziness in the orbit of a planet around a star is negligible because the planet is so big compared to an atom. So most of science is not held up through the fact that we have these two disjoint achievements of 20th century physics, the microworld of the quantum and the cosmos and cosmology, where Einstein's theory holds sway. But right back at the very beginning, when, as it were, the whole universe was squeezed to the size of an atom, then quantum fluctuations could shake the entire universe. So clearly you do need a theory which unifies the very large and the very small to understand what's going on. And until we have that theory, we won't be able to answer these embarrassing questions like what happened before the beginning. We suspect that the answer to those questions is that the whole idea of space and time has to be revised and extra dimensions come into play, etc. But right back at the beginning, we in cosmology, who normally think about very large things, do need to take cognizance of the very tiniest structures. And therefore, we are very interested in developments made by people using big accelerators.
Thank you. You mentioned space several times there, and you mentioned this was something you would like to talk a little more about. I wasn't sure whether you meant rooms and facilities for your...
Yes.
But I think you meant space in a wider sense.
Well, that's right, because, of course, space technology, which arose primarily through the pressure of defence requirements, building rockets, etc., ICBMs, that has been very important for my science in two ways. First, we were able to send probes to the planets and actually land probes on Mars, etc. We've understood a lot more about the solar system through actually sending things there. But also, by sending telescopes up into orbit, you can observe in a way that you can't from down on the ground. There are two advantages of going into orbit. One is that by getting above the blurring effect of the Earth's atmosphere, you get much sharper images, and that's why the Hubble Space Telescope is so important. But also, there are certain kinds of radiation, ultraviolet, infrared and X-rays, which are emitted by cosmic objects, and which don't get down to ground level because they're absorbed in the atmosphere. So, by going up into space, you can observe in different sort of windows, as it were. It's rather like if you think of the keys on a piano, the electromagnetic spectrum goes from the radio, infrared, optical, UV and X-rays, and the optical is just like one octave, as it were. And if we go into space, we can see a whole wider range. And so, by being on the ground, it's like being able to detect notes in a certain fairly narrow range of pitches, but we can learn a lot more by going into space. So, through space technology, we have been able to extend our knowledge, and a lot of the discoveries to be made, in particular some of the ones I worked on about extreme cosmic explosions and the early universe, would not have been possible had it not been for data which have been gained from equipment put up in space above the Earth's atmosphere. So that's a very important part of my subject. But of course, that's only been made possible as a byproduct of a development of a technology which is driven by other imperatives. I mean, obviously, space developed in the Soviet Union and in the US because of superpower rivalry, and of course it's continued to be developed for military purposes, but now also for commercial purposes. I mean, in our everyday life we depend on space for telecommunications, GPS, position-sensitive detectors, and all kinds of other things. So space is very important technologically, and I think now the civilian expenditure on space exceeds the military expenditure. And of course the scientific expenditure is a tiny spin-off of all that, but nonetheless very important. If we look ahead to the future of space, then there are plans being made for larger instruments which will be able to study very distant objects and therefore see back in time and see back to when the very first stars and galaxies were forming, because the further away you look, the further back you're looking in time. And also, these new instruments will be able to detect planets around other stars, even planets like the Earth. That will be very exciting because the planets we have detected so far are big ones, rather like Jupiter and Saturn, the giants of our solar system. And we'd really like to see evidence for any planets more like the Earth. And within 20 years, we certainly have telescopes in space that would be able to image a planet like the Earth orbiting another star. It won't be really a sharp image, but we can learn quite a lot. To illustrate what we could learn, let's imagine you were an alien looking at our solar system from, say, 30 light years away, distance of a nearby star. Then if you were looking from that distance, the Sun would look a fairly ordinary star, and the Earth would be about 1 billion times fainter. It would, in Carl Sagan's nice phrase, look like a pale blue dot orbiting around that star and very close to it in the sky. If you were an alien and had a very powerful telescope, you might be able to pick out this Earth, which would be a challenge like open for a firefly next to a searchlight, because it would look very close in the sky to its star, our Sun. But if the aliens could look at this pale blue dot, even if they could just see it faintly, they could learn quite a bit about it if they kept watching, because the shade of blue would be slightly different depending on whether the Pacific Ocean or the Eurasian landmass was facing you. And if you kept on watching, you could learn the length of the year, the length of the day, and that there were seasons, etc. Well, 20 years from now, we'll be doing that sort of thing for stars like the Sun, 30 light years away, to see if they have planets orbiting them like our Earth. And we learn something about the topography and even the atmosphere of those planets. The question then will be, is there life on any of those other worlds? And that's a separate question. And that's a question of biologists. And biology is a much harder subject than astronomy. And the question of the origin of life isn't understood here on Earth. And until we understand that, we won't have a feel for how likely it is that life got started elsewhere. But that, of course, is one of the great challenges of 21st century physics. So if we look at what space science is going to do for us in the next 20 years, one thing is going to be to allow us to study other Earth-like planets around stars. But if we look at the development of space science and technology, of course, it has not been motivated by only sending bombs into space and instruments into space, but it's also been motivated by sending people into space. And of course, the high point, perhaps, the greatest space spectacular was the American moon landings in the late 1960s and early 70s. And that, of course, was a crash program driven by a superpower rivalry, where the Americans made tremendous efforts to land people on the moon. I'm old enough to remember that as an exciting episode. But of course, it's interesting to note that the last man on the moon, who was there in 1972, was there more than 35 years ago. And so, to those people who are young today, men on the moon is past history. I'd say cynically that to school kids now, they know the Americans landed a man on the moon, and they know the Egyptians built the pyramids, but these both seem equally arcane national goals, which are hard to understand the motives for. But anyway, the moon landings were not, as some of us thought at the time, the step towards a program of exploring the planets by sending people to Mars, etc. But it was a one-off episode which was motivated by superpower rivalry, and there was no motive to continue with the immense expenditure needed to continue it. But that does raise the question of whether people will return to the moon and what is the long-term future for people in space. There's lots of debate about this. Some people say that it's very exciting to send people into space, but if we look at what's happened in the last 10 or 20 years and what's made the headlines, there's been lots of publicity for the marvellous pictures taken by the Hubble telescope, the pictures sent back from the surface of Mars and from the moons of Jupiter by space probes. But the human exploration of space has only made the headlines when there's been a disaster. The shuttle has twice crashed, and that's caused public interest, naturally. But the International Space Station, which is in near-Earth orbit and is circling round and round the Earth, doesn't really inspire the public very much, because more than 30 years after people walked on the moon is not very exciting that they should circle round and round the Earth at huge expense. And so the question really is, whether there is a future for manned spaceflight. The Americans have enunciated another long-term program to go back to the moon and go to Mars, but I'm unsure whether that will ever materialise, because it's very long-term, and the American civilian program is very risk-averse. The shuttle accidents have been sort of national traumas, as it were, even though the shuttle has a 98% safety record. And I think one of the problems with the American NASA space program is that they have presented it as though it's a low-risk venture, and therefore failures have been followed by delays and inquiries and extra expenditure, etc. I mean, it would be far better if they accepted that space travel is very dangerous, regarded these people as like intrepid test pilots, and accepted that there would be lots of accidents. And I think that's going to be hard for the American public and politicians to accept. So my personal view is that the only future of manned spaceflight lies in a different approach, a high-risk private enterprise approach, when costs come down and costs are cut so that private enterprise can finance the venture, and people will go accepting much higher risks than the American taxpayer is prepared to impose on publicly financed astronauts. And people are willing to go. Lots of people are willing to go to Mars with a one-way ticket. There's no problem getting people.
Or be sent by their relatives.
Well, indeed, yes. And I'd volunteer to go when I was a bit older, but not quite yet. But I think that if it was funded by private enterprise in the same way that Formula One racing is, or by individual people, and the people who went on these expeditions were regarded as high-risk adventurers like mountaineers, round-the-world balloonists and such like, then there may be a future for manned space flight as an adventure. And I think we've got to emphasise it's an adventure because the practical case for sending people gets weaker and weaker all the time with each advance in miniaturisation and robotics, because we can build more and more sophisticated robots, we can miniaturise things, and so many of the activities which needed people can now be done without them. And I think the cost is far less, obviously, if you don't send the people. The European effort in space has been rather low level compared to the United States, and that's because superpower rivalry ramped up the American-Russian expenditures to a much higher level, whereas in most areas of technology, Europe as a whole is about at parity with the United States. We're similar as an economy and in intellectual firepower, as it were. In space, the European Space Agency has a budget about a third or a quarter of NASA's. But my personal view is, as a European, that we in Europe should eschew manned spaceflight completely and spend all our budget on advanced robotics, miniaturisation and science. And if we do that, then we can fully match what the Americans do, because they spend 3/4 of their larger budget on the manned program. So if we decide we're not going to do that, then I think we can do very well. And just as the leading particle physics lab in the world is now at CERN in Geneva, so we can make the leading space science an activity which is driven from Europe.
Thank you. You mentioned another subject which you were interested in was education. Is that the education of scientists, or as President of the Royal Society, the education of the general public in what science does? Or
well, I think those are two important goals, and it's important that they are separate goals. I think we all realise that the future of our society does depend on technical innovation, maybe better directed than it has been up till now, and therefore we do need people who are going to be able to understand science at the highest level and engage in research in medicine and environmental science, etc. And certainly from a nationalistic perspective, we in the UK will not have a bright future unless we can maintain our expertise in science and technology in the face of the growing competition, not just from the United States but from the Far East. So I think it's very important that we in the UK should maintain our standards of education and research for specialists in science and technology. But a quite separate issue is, of course, giving the wider public, most of whom are not going to be professional scientists, a feel for science and technology. And this is also important because young people are going to grow up in a world ever more moulded by science and technology, and where we are going to be faced with more and more ethical choices about how to apply science. I mean, obviously in applications of genetics and biology, and how we cope with the consequences of our collective actions on the atmosphere, global warming and loss of biodiversity, etc. These are issues which are technical but involve ethical and practical judgments. And we need a public which is well enough informed to be able to participate in debates on these questions, because it shouldn't be just the professional scientists who decide on the applications of science. They have no special ethical sensitivities, and what is important is that the scientists should feel an obligation to explain the scientific background to the crucial decisions society and politicians have to make, and participate in dialogue with the wider public. But the wider public obviously has to have some feel for science if that debate is to get above the level of tabloid slogans. And so I think it's very important that everyone should have some sort of feel for science in order that we can make democratic decisions on how science should be applied in the rest of this century. And obviously it's the key ideas and not the details which we can hope that people will understand, and also the fact that we are never really certain about things. Scientists find it hard to explain that we are pretty sure of something but never certain, and that nothing is ever risk-free. I mean, the worst kind of question which a politician can be asked is there a risk from X or not? Say yes or no. You can never answer that question, whether it's the MMR vaccine or anything else. You've just got to say that the risks are very low and that we should listen to this batch of experts rather than that batch of experts, etc. So I think it's very, very important to ensure that the public has a feel for what science can do, what the issues are, how they depend on scientific knowledge, and what the uncertainties are, so that there can be a real dialogue extending far beyond the scientific community about how we ensure that the scientific discoveries that are being made are used for the broadest national and international benefit. So I think all of us who are active in scientific academies and universities ought to be concerned about not just maintaining the standards of education for specialists in the subject, but also in outreach to ensure that the public is aware of scientific issues. I mean, I think scientists sometimes bemoan public ignorance too much, because I think although there is public ignorance about many key scientific questions, some people don't know the difference between a proton and a protein. I think it's just as worrying that people are ignorant of history. I mean, you can't have any well-informed opinion on what's happening in the Middle East without having a bit more background, or what's happening in the Balkans, etc., without having some knowledge of history. And I think we should equally bemoan the fact that the average person is uninformed about the historical background to those key arenas, as we should bemoan the fact that they may not understand the basis of science.
You talked before about one form of public outreach, which is popular science writing. Are there other forms that you think are particularly important? For example, possibly television or museums or YouTube or whatever?
Yes. Well, I think the new communication media via the internet are crucially important. I think if a scientist really wants to get his or her ideas over clearly, then writing a book or an article is the surest way, because then the fewer intermediaries, you can get your words out there fairly straight. I think for television, I've had some experience of television for one of the main terrestrial channels, and I found that frustrating, because one realises the compromises you have to make, because the average viewer is surfing the channels and can't be expected to pay attention for a whole hour, and that leads to a lot of repetition, etc., and a lot of distraction. So I think it's very hard to present any serious ideas on the main TV channels. But I think that with the internet, etc., it's going to be possible to make videos available to not a sort of audience of millions, but to a large audience of discerning viewers, as it were. And so I think there may be a revival of serious documentaries, as it were. But quite apart from actually expounding ideas, then dialogue is very important. And I think scientists have often been rather remiss in being unwilling to get into the arena and get involved in dialogue with the public and with others. They don't participate in intellectual life as much as they should, and are regarded as rather sort of ghettoised compared to other intellectuals. And I think that's worrying for two reasons. First, because I think what they have to say is fascinating to a wider audience than the specialists, but also I think it's important for the image of the scientific profession that its practitioners should not be perceived as sort of standoffish or elitist, and should be willing to participate in discussions and get involved in politics, etc.
Is this what you mean by the public responsibility of scientists?
I think scientists do have a responsibility to engage with the public when their work has potential implications of ethical or societal character, because the scientists may be the first to realise what the implications of their work are, and they have an obligation, therefore, to bring these ideas to public attention. I think the classic case of this, perhaps, is the atomic scientists in World War II, who, of course, in great secrecy developed the atomic bomb. But many of the physicists who came from academia and worked on the bomb project during World War II then went back to academia afterwards. But they did maintain a long-term concern and feeling of responsibility to do all they could to urge steps towards arms control. And of course they were involved in very high stakes indeed. But I think many of those people did in fact take a very responsible attitude. I'm thinking of people like Joseph Rotblat and Hans Bethe, who were involved in Los Alamos, but devoted the rest of their lives, or large parts of the rest of their lives, to campaigning to control the powers they had helped to unleash, as it were. And I think they set an example. They knew very well that the decisions on nuclear weapons were political decisions, and that they were not decisions made by scientists, but they felt that they had a special obligation. And to give another analogy, you may not be able to control your teenage children, but you're a pretty poor parent if you don't care what happens to them. And likewise, if you're a scientist, then your ideas are in a sense your intellectual progeny, and you should care what happens to your ideas, but they should be used for human benefit, and that the risks of their misuse should be minimised. So scientists do have a responsibility. And I've been privileged to know some of the people who were involved in Los Alamos, and most of them are now sadly no longer with us, but people like Bethe and Rotblat and Rudy Piles, who were very great scientists, but did have this feeling of responsibility. And they, of course, were put in this extraordinary position in World War II. And there's no complete counterpart of that in the younger generation. I should say that I've been a bit involved in pugwash type activities.
Why is it called pugwash?
Well, it's a slightly odd name, but the reason was that in 1955, I think it was, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein signed a famous manifesto, which was in fact drafted for them by Joseph Rotblat. And as a consequence of this, an institution was formed to get together scientists from East and West. And Joseph Rotblat, who instigated this movement, remained its moving spirit for 50 years until his death. And the first meeting of this organisation was funded by a Canadian millionaire called Cyrus Eaton, and took place at his home village called Pugwash in Nova Scotia. And that was in 1957. And the conferences therefore got the name Pugwash Conference, and 200 or 300 have been held since then. The Pugwash conferences were especially important in the 1960s because there was at that time very little opportunity for interaction between the scientists in the Soviet Union and the West. And they were able to meet in an informal way at these Pugwash conferences, and then they reported back to their governments. And I think the record suggests that in the 1960s these meetings were helpful in at least lubricating the steps towards the partial test ban treaty in 1963 and in leading to the anti-ballistic missile treaty in around 1970. Because the scientists then reported back to their governments. Of course, subsequently, a lot more channels opened up and the agenda became wider than the superpower confrontation, so Pugwash lost its sort of unique role, but it was important at the time. And one of the most remarkable people I've ever been privileged to know was Joseph Rotblat, who was the founder of Pugwash, and he died less than 2 years ago, at the age of 96, but right up to within a few months of his death, he was really working full-time on Pugwash and campaigning to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And at least he had the satisfaction of seeing that in his last years, this goal came to seem less utopian. There was something called the Canberra Commission that he was on, which contained people like Robert McNamara, which expounded this as a long-term goal. And Rod McNamara, who in his later years he produced this film called The Fog of War, which was his mea culpa about Vietnam, etc. But he then became convinced that we'd come very close to catastrophe at the time of the Cuba crisis, etc., where he was very close to the central reaction, of course, and that the only long-term hope was if we could rid the world of nuclear weapons. And so it was not just people who could be dismissed as idealists like Joe Rotblat, but people who were more hard-nosed in their background anyway, like McNamara, who came to believe that we should strive harder towards this goal, and they were concerned about nuclear proliferation and about the fact that in the NPT treaty there was an understanding that the 5 first powers to get nuclear weapons were in a special category, but in order to discourage proliferation, those 5 powers had an obligation to cut down their own stockpiles, and they were falling down on that obligation. And so this was one of the things that Rotblat and McNamara continued to urge.
Thank you. I know you've written a book about some aspects of the future and what you think might happen in the 21st century and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about these things. No doubt it depends on what you've had for breakfast, but given what we know of all these constraints we're hitting and buffers and of Malthusian and non-Malthusian kind, do you feel hopeful for our grandchildren or not?
Well, one has to try to be hopeful, but I think we are going to confront a whole lot of new challenges, because the 21st century is special. It's the first century when human beings collectively and singly are going to have an effect on the entire planet. Of course, collectively we're well aware of the consequences which we're having all changing the climate, destroying biodiversity, etc. And it's very good that this has come up the political agenda as a long-term concern. So one issue which I'm very worried about is whether we can cope with rising population and the aspirations of the developing world, etc., without leading to some irreversible long-term deleterious effect on the climate and on our biosphere generally. So that's one type of issue. But the other issue which I focused on in my book, and this was I think a more distinctive contribution in my book, was that we confront a new set of risks from the fact that we are living in a more and more interconnected world where individuals are more empowered than ever before. And this therefore means that society is far more vulnerable. We've always accepted that there are risks and any new technology is risky, but we now confront a new class of risks which are potentially more catastrophic. I mean, there are risks from just error in the use of new technology, which could be catastrophic. I mean, in the early days of steam, obviously lots of boilers exploded, and that was horrible for those nearby, but there was an upper limit to just how horrible. Whereas we can imagine technologies, biotech of some kind, leading to some hazard which has a global impact. And even though the probability may be very low, our concern is affected by the probability multiplied by the consequences. And if the consequences are really catastrophic, we should still be worried, even if the probability is low. So that's a new class of risks we need to worry about, of some sort of unintended consequence of new technologies in our interconnected world. And also, of course, there's the risk of terror of various kinds. And here I'm concerned about the great empowerment of individuals who will be able to use not just the traditional ways of causing hazard or havoc, but new technology. And the kind of thing that concerned me particularly in my book was people with the mindset of those who now design computer viruses, but actually be able to design real viruses. Bioterror and bioerror are a new class of threat. And the question is how we can cope with these. I mean, one hopes that these technologies will be applied to human benefit and with great caution, but the global village will have its village idiots, and it's very hard to cope with them, because even one could be too many. And this I regard as a very intractable problem that we will have to cope with, dealing with the empowerment of individuals. And I'm not just thinking of the traditional terrorists that we are concerned about now, the fundamentalists, etc. But there can be all kinds. I mean, you could imagine eco-freaks who think that the world would be better off without human beings, or the strange science-based cults, you know, which at least warn us that people who believe in science aren't necessarily in touch with rationality or reality. And so I think there's a real new risk from people who are competent in science, but out of touch with reality and obsessive or extremist in other views. And so that's something we have to cope with. So in summary, I think we have the collective consequences of our actions, which can be catastrophic for the biosphere, and also the consequences of individual error and terror amplified in our future world, which is more interconnected and where individuals are more empowered. So for those reasons, I think the 21st century will be especially hazardous one, where we will have to confront not just the traditional risks, but a new set of risks. And also, of course, technology is advancing faster than ever and on a broader front. We couldn't have predicted now, well, so we couldn't have predicted in 1900 the world today, but still less can we predict the world in 100 years from now on the basis of what we can observe today, because technology is not only advancing faster, but on a broader front. I mean, we're changing the world in new ways. We're changing human beings for the first time. One thing that hasn't changed over the thousands of years of human history has been basic human physique and human nature. But of course, with new kinds of drugs, even that may change. So for the very first time, human beings are going to change, and that also is a new kind of uncertainty, a new kind of dangerous feedback into society. And so for all these reasons, I think we are going to have challenges which politicians will find it hard to cope with. When I wrote this book, when I talk about this, people say, does the fact that you are an astronomer have any special impact on your views? And my answer to that is essentially no. I mean, I think I'm just expressing these views as someone who is a scientist and in touch with scientists and has a feel for how science is going. But I think there is one distinctive perspective which scientists bring to these issues if they are familiar with cosmology and astronomy. And that is, they have an awareness of the very long-term future as well as the past. Unless you're a creationist, you're happy with the idea that we're the outcome of 4 billion years of evolution, and as a cosmologist I can go back 13 or 14 billion years to the Big Bang when the first atoms were made. But even people familiar with that tend somehow to feel that we humans are in some sense the culmination, we're the end of all this. But I know as an astronomer that the sun is less than halfway through its life. The sun will flare up and die in about 6 billion years. But it's less than halfway through its life, and any creatures which witness the demise of the sun won't be humans. They'll be as different from us as we are from bacteria. And so that therefore means that if we have unintended consequences in the 21st century which destroy the future of life on Earth, then those consequences could resonate very far into the future to even what you might call a post-human era. So in a sense, if one is aware of the long-term future of life here on Earth and perhaps far beyond, then one has an extra reason for concern over and above what obviously concerns us, which is our immediate descendants. So that's the only extra perspective which I bring. Incidentally, the cosmic importance of what happens here on Earth depends on another fascinating question, which is the kind of thing taxi drivers always ask me if they know I'm an astronomer, and that's, is there any life out there? Is there life out there? And the answer I give to that question is we just don't know. It's, as I said, it's a biological question, and we don't know how likely it is that life got started. Even if life got started, we don't know how likely it is that it evolved into something we call intelligence. We can't conceive what other kinds of life might exist. But of course, if life is already widespread, then you could say in a real cosmic perspective, then our Earth and Sun are just a tiny fragment, whereas if life is a very rare phenomenon, it could be that our Earth, tiny though it is cosmically important because it may be the one place where life got to this self-aware state. But I think one of the other exciting challenges of the 21st century is to understand the origin of life and whether life does exist on any of the other planets I mentioned earlier. And that's going to be a subject which, as so many of the exciting challenges in science, links together all the disciplines, because you need to be expert in astronomy and in physics and in biology in order to address that kind of question.
No one except yourself could do that, Martin. Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful interview.